Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners. I hope you're all well. Today's video is a reflective piece. I want to cover a little bit of my journey to set out some questions that troubled me and which provided the impetus for me to study more about Islam, to research more. These questions were my quest, and a lot of these questions sat within the remit of the topic we generally refer to as women in Islam or women and Islam. In my late teens, I started to become aware of some discourses about women. The one that used to be very popular was about the intellect of women, and we often hear a hadith tradition that says, that is often translated as, women are of inferior intellect, that there is defect in their intellect and there is defect in their religion or their faith. So they're defective in intellect and defective in faith. I also used to hear, coming from Pakistan, which had already had a female prime minister, the late Benazir Bhutto, and we used to hear a lot about how women could not be political leaders, that they were not meant to lead nations, and if they lead nations, then they will end up in disaster. These were the kind of discourses I was becoming aware of in my late teens. And I started to think a lot about my relationship with Allah, my relationship with God, who I understand as the fairest of judges, the fairest of beings, and who's not prone to bias. And I used to think about how Allah could claim to be a fair God if he has created men to be superior to women, but then set the same level of accountability. If my intellect is inferior, surely I should get some mitigation for accountability in the hereafter, just as a young child will be assessed differently, or somebody who has a mental impairment would be given some mitigation for that impairment. If, as a woman, as I'm told by many male traditionalist scholars, my intellect is inferior, then surely my accountability should also be set to a lower standard. But when you read the Quran, when you read the Hadith, you find that women will be accountable for the same sins and for the same crimes as men would be. So we don't see any mitigation on the basis of gender. So then I used to think about whether, as a Muslim woman, I was supposed to carry all the burden, the full burden of accountability, whilst possessing a lesser faculty of reason. And why was I expected to accept the point that I was intellectually inferior? And what did that even mean? When scholars say that a woman's testimony is worth half of that of a man, what does that actually mean? What are the legal implications of that? And why was I meant to act as a subordinate person in a marriage and defer all decision making to the male head of household? Was Islam a patriarchal religion, and was the Quran a patriarchal text? And at the heart of this was this troublesome thought that resurfaced again and again, this contradiction between a just God and a God who has bias towards a gender. Because if we say that God is biased towards the male gender or prefers the male gender, then we are putting a question mark over the fairness of God. Is he a fair God? And if he is a fair God, why is he biased? So you can see that it creates a contradiction. And if God has given me weaker intellect, then how can he hold me accountable to the same level? So those two are interrelated questions, but then there are these contradictions at the heart of these questions in terms of our personal relationship, our personal faith, where we envisage God as fair, as just, and unbiased. And that's how the journey of my inquiry started. And I spent many, many years leaning towards ultra-conservative interpretations of Islam. And at that point, I was convinced that this is it. I've found guidance, and absolutely, this is the truth. And I have to say, I've learned from that experience. And one of the key insights from that experience is that if any group of people gives you the guarantee that you found the truth, then that should actually ring alarm bells in your head, because there is no guarantee of truth. All we can do is walk the path and keep searching for it. But there was a period of time that I became convinced, and I was following quite conservative interpretations of Islam. In my late 20s, early 30s, I leant towards that. And it was also during that time that I was also wearing the hijab. So I was a hijabi for a long period of time. And questions of identity had become very important to me after I moved to Britain, where Muslims are a minority. And suddenly your sense of identity as a Muslim becomes a very important question to you. It was also during that period that I was very judgmental about other Muslims. And it was interesting. I was talking to a fellow researcher and she was saying how all of us have been on this journey. And there have been a few years when we have just been convinced that this is it. I've got the truth. I understand everything. This is what Islam is. And anybody who disagrees with me is a disbeliever. So we've all been through that phase. But thankfully, learned from that phase, reflected on it, sought forgiveness from Allah for any arrogance that entered my head during that period of time. And my leaning away from conservative Islam happened when I started my doctorate. And I started reading about Islamic fiqh. I started to read reformist scholars who were working in this area. And I became aware of the process of knowledge creation. It's really important for us to pause and think about it, because we sometimes just see knowledge as a simple process. We see received knowledge as something that is not to be questioned, whatever we receive from our parents or what we receive from scholars that we admire. But we don't realize that there is a process of knowledge creation taking place. Scholars are making decisions about what to choose as an interpretation, what translations to select for a particular piece of Quranic text, how to approach that text, how to infer rulings from that text. These are all choices people make. So there is a process of knowledge creation, and then of course the community decides what they think is going to be authentic or not. So knowledge isn't something that just happens to sit on the table. It is created, and behind that creation of knowledge are choices made by human beings to interpret the Islamic sources in a particular way. Neither do we receive the Quran as robots and we don't follow it literally. We engage with it intellectually and we come up with explanations. And when we engage with it intellectually, then our upbringing, our background, our social history, our cultural history, our political situation, all of that feeds into how we engage with the Quran. And this process is not black and white. It is only the ultra-conservative scholars or fundamentalists who will give you those certainties about Islam and say, this is halal, this is haram, black, white, this is the truth, this is not the truth. Whenever something like that is happening, it means that they have not approached the Quran in a meaningful way. And all they're doing is they're insisting that knowledge is certain and everything's absolute. This kind of absolute certainty does not exist in Islam. Islam is about our engagement with the Quran, our engagement with the Sunnah and with the Hadith. And this engagement changes, and it should change as we are shaped by experiences in our lives and as our knowledge improves. And there are always lots of gray areas when it comes to interpretations and rules. So anyone who tells you about black and white, yes, no, just be very wary of scholars who give you those certainties. Those certainties are comfortable, by the way. When you've entered that certainty, like I did for a period of time, you feel this is it. I have reached the destination. The fact is, there is no guarantee that we've reached the destination. Remember, Islam talks about walking the path. It talks about Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. It's about the process of walking. It's not about where we end up. Where we end up is up to Allah. He will decide where we end up. The destination is in His hands. Our role is to walk the path. And in doing that, we can make mistakes, make errors, and there would be a variety of interpretations that we come up against. So it was a key insight for me to realize that Islam is not some kind of a given knowledge or a manual of instructions or something which is absolute and can only be followed in the way somebody wrote about it 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or 10 years ago. Islam is, the knowledge of Islam is created. It is created by the followers of Islam and those who study this religion. We create that knowledge. And this is an important insight, okay? It helps us step away from absolutism or following absolute rulings. So once I'd understood that there is a process of interpretation taking place, I could then think about what feeds into those interpretations. Why is it that such gendered interpretations of the Quran and Hadith reach us, and they tend to favor the male gender? So something's happened in that process for us to end up with those teachings. And in the next few videos, I want to share my understanding of how I've understood some of these key issues where I think that socio-historical circumstances, political circumstances, the relevance of existing knowledge in society, existing views about women, how they shaped scholars' interpretations of various issues of Islamic law and theology. And I will particularly talk about the hijab and its link to women's presence in the public sphere. I'll talk about the reports about the intellect and faith of Muslim women, which are often used to take our agency away from us as believers. So if we give our interpretation of the Quran, we're told that actually we're not entitled to, because we don't have the intellect to be able to engage with the Quran. So our interpretations are dismissed on the basis of our gender. I will talk about marriage and polygamy, and in marriage particularly, I will talk about the relationship between spouses, which again in traditionalist thought, and actually even some reformist and progressive scholars also give the same interpretations, where there is a male head of household and a woman is given a subordinate role. And then I will talk about political and religious leadership. So it's going to be a series of videos around these topics, which are so close to the heart of so many Muslim women and have such an impact on our faith, personally, collectively, how we connect to God, how we connect to society. Now, you might wonder why it's important. Just look around you. There is a lot of oppression of Muslim women. I think we should just accept the fact that that is the case. I believe in self-reflection. I believe in taking ownership. And I think as a community, we need to take ownership of the fact that we really need to think about how we view women as believers and how we view women as human beings. Women are not even allowed, in some conservative societies, Muslim societies, women are not even allowed to decide how many children to bring into the world. Other people make those decisions for them. They don't have autonomy over their bodies. They don't have the choice for study or work. They're not allowed those choices. So there is real oppression happening around us, and I'm sure that you would have come across many examples of that. There is a strong resistance to women occupying public spaces. We've had some horrendous situations as well where women have been physically beaten up or acid thrown in their faces because they're in public spaces. There is a lot of abuse in marriages. Forced marriages also happen in some communities. And unfortunately, we find that hadith and fiqh rulings are misused to justify quite ugly misogyny, and to continually assign that subordinate and submissive role to Muslim women, making the case that our deen requires women to seclude, that our deen requires women to be submissive and tolerate physical and verbal abuse from husbands, and that this is a requirement from our deen. This is what God wants from us. Okay, this is the argument that's put in front of us. And social media is full of hateful preachers who relish issuing misogynistic rulings against women in the name of Islam. Okay, they always present this in the name of Islam. So things like my wife prays in a closet, this is actually presented as an Islamic ruling. It's a preference that women should pray in a closet. So these kind of discourses are all around us, and they're having such an impact. I think one of the most profound impacts is on young Muslim women who are now growing up in society, listening to all of that, this clash here between what they understand of Islam, what they believe about God, and what is being told about Islam, about the rights of women in Islam by traditionalists, or I would say very conservative scholars who have a real issue with accepting the presence of women in the public sphere, or to give them the autonomy that I believe that God and His Prophet have given them. So I often say that the Muslim community will never emerge from its profound decline as long as one half of the Ummah, which is Muslim men, continue to commit injustices against the other half of the Ummah, which is Muslim women. There will never be any barakah, there will never be any blessing until we change that. So I bring you back to the question I posed earlier. Is the Quran a patriarchal text favoring women? Is Islam favoring men? Is Islam a patriarchal religion favoring men? This is a really important and complex question, and one that we need to answer, and one that we need to really ponder on if we are to accept women as believers who have the same level of agency and autonomy as Muslim men do, and to give them the same rights, same human rights that men enjoy. I leave you with the great insight from Asma Barlas. So she's talking about reading the Quran in her book, Believing Women in Islam. I'm reading from page 4, the bottom of page 4, and going on to page 5. She says, my purpose here is not to deny that the Quran can be read in patriarchal modes as privileging males, or that oppressive practices in many Muslim societies often stem from an uncritical adherence to what are assumed to be Islamic norms and strictures, or that the images of the woman in the Muslim unconscious are indeed misogynistic. Nor do I deny that the enveloping maleness of Muslim religious text engenders grave problems for women, as does the legalization of sexual inequality by classical Muslim law, the Sharia. Rather, I argue that descriptions of Islam as a religious patriarchy that allegedly has God on its side confuse the Quran with a specific reading of it, ignoring that all texts, including the Quran, can be read in multiple modes, including egalitarian ones. And this is a really important point, a key insight from Asma Barlas, that the Quran is a text and it can be read in multiple ways. Men can read the Quran in a particular way, women can read the Quran in a particular way, children can read the Quran in a particular way. But when we allege that Islam is a religious patriarchy, then we're confusing a specific reading of the Quran, a patriarchal reading of the Quran, with the Quran itself. And what we're saying is that multiple readings are not possible, even egalitarian ones. In other words, we can read the Quran in egalitarian ways. And these are some of the things, some of the insights, and some of the processes of knowledge creation that I'll bring to your attention as I talk about these important topics pertaining to women. Thank you very much for listening. Assalamu alaikum.